So you may have noticed that when I talk to James, I speak a little bit differently than I speak to other adults or even older children. And this is something parents and even non-parents do naturally when they're interacting with a baby. They modify their speech in a way that we call motherese or infant-directed talk. And the characteristics of infant-directed talk change across the age of the baby. So with a very young baby, you're likely to really just modulate the intonation and the pitch. Babies like high-pitched sounds. Huh? Yeah. And you notice the big pauses. And then as babies start reaching the point where they're ready to learn about language, maternal, paternal, parental speech becomes more simplified. And then they start using shorter phrases, shorter sentences, maybe put the label of an object that they might both be looking at the end of a sentence.
Yeah, are you a wolf? Oh!
When a baby is very young, it's just sort of the melody and the rhythm of speech that attracts them in infant-directed speech.
With the you like swimming in the bathtub?
There you go. 2 arms.
As they get a little bit older, parents just naturally start using these shorter sentences that are a little bit simplified, and then they modify their speech again as the child gets older.
One thing that we're looking at is we're interested in how babies' early development in language, their processing of different sounds, and their ability to learn words might influence later language development, like their vocabulary learning and their reading abilities. So we're tracking infants, looking at them early on at about 18 months of age and seeing how they respond to different parts of language and seeing how these infants might respond to language later on, so that we might be able to detect language delay early on or to detect language excellence early on. We think there might actually be a link between early language abilities and later language abilities. One possibility is that babies who are better at processing different sounds and learning different types of words early on are then also going to be better later on at learning vocabulary or learning how to read. The other possibility is that there might not be anything. All babies eventually learn to learn words, they learn how to read, and so there might actually not be any relationship between early language learning and later language learning, and this is what we're investigating. I've tested some children who at 18 months the child wasn't learning words at all, they weren't speaking, and parents were very concerned. And when we go back and see these children at grade 2, they're reading a ton, they're doing math, they're just really at the top of their class, they blow me away with their spelling abilities, and it's heartening to see that. So it's not always that you have to be concerned early on. It's great to be involved and interested and paying attention to your child, but it doesn't necessarily mean that if they're having language difficulties early on, that they'll have trouble later on. One of the things that's really important for parents to know about language is that babies start listening right from the start. They're learning language even before they're born. So it's really important for parents to just talk to babies, to use language around them, anything. And babies are listening and picking up on that just from the earliest stages of development. And they're ready to learn anything and are so interested in language that they just pick up on all of it.
Some children like the communicative aspect of language rather than the referential, rather than the labeling and the pulling out the structure. And they just love to do that turn-taking and play with their voice and have the prosody and everything. And sometimes you see individual words and the beginning of combinations of words that you can understand a little bit later in those children. But boy, do they have the rules, the pragmatic, the rules of conversation down. So there are multiple routes to language acquisition as well. Are you blowing bubbles? Yeah. When James was born, he wasn't vocalizing like that. He was crying, he was making some vegetative sounds, and gradually those turned into babbling. The crying into vowels, the vegetative sounds into consonants, and now, and he didn't know when he was born necessarily, although he might have, that language was about communication. But now you can see, as soon as I start talking, James wants to talk too. And we're doing some turn taking. Hey there, James. Hey. Yeah. When James was born, he was sensitive to the properties of any of the languages of the world, to the rhythm, to the melody, to the consonants and vowels. He's still sensitive to many of those properties, but he's beginning to focus in on a lot of the properties of the language that he's hearing, which in this case is English. Hey, James. Yes. And as you can see, he's learned some highly familiar words. James turns to his name now, and there are other words that he'll probably recognize. Words like tummy. Yeah, he doesn't necessarily know that tummy stands for his tummy, but it's something he's probably heard before. Yeah, words like mommy. Yeah, and daddy. He'll listen differently to those types of words. Yeah. Then to a word like, oh, he'll also like baby. Yeah, where's the baby? Yeah. But if I say, where's the calculator? He's not so interested. There's a huge range in the age at which children start talking. So you might hear first words as early as 8.5, 9 months. More likely by 11 or 12 months you're going to hear a few words, you know, mama, dada. A little bit later, what that, or da, which might mean tell me what that is. There is just an enormous range. And I think that's difficult for parents because one child at 15, 16 months might be talking away and another child is just beginning to say those first few words. By about 22, 23 months old, if a child isn't talking very much at all, then that's reason for concern and a child should be taken for evaluation.
Ladder fire truck, yeah? Shall we make a big ladder or a small ladder? You want a small ladder? Okay.
Actually, any time a parent is worried, and seriously worried, they're not just nervous, that's a time for evaluation because I think parents are pretty intuitive observers. So one child at 22 months will only be saying like 3 words, and so will another child, and one of those children may have a language delay and the other one will not. And it isn't that parents always know, but sometimes if they have some intuition, it's good to do something about that. Now again, it isn't necessarily the case that a child who's a slow talker is going to have a permanent language delay.
Well, particularly early in life, nurturing relationships are those that are interactive, that involve touch, that involve exchanges of information and speech. Nurturing relationships in the first year of life are moms who are willing to touch their babies, to carry their babies, to speak to their babies, even to read to their young infants, to be responsive to the information that the baby is giving back to the mom.
Oh, you smell so good. Yes, you do.
Learning to read the baby's emotions, the baby's response to different experiences, and interacting with that baby around those experiences. So it is this kind of what we think of as a serve and return kind of relationship, a relationship that involves contingent responses, that involve hearing or reading the baby's response to the experience, and then feeding back to the baby, interacting around an experience. We know that children's ability to understand language comes before their ability to accurately produce language that's understandable by others. I think that it is appropriate and very helpful for a young infant to be talked to. And there's a lot that's communicated in language that isn't simply the words, the understanding of the words, but also has to do with the tone of emotion or reassurance or calming. And those are all aspects of language that even young infants can pick up on and at some level understand.
Have a smile.
It is never too early to begin talking to an infant. Even a fetus in prenatal life can be talked to and hears its mother and father's language in the external world.
Babies are, at least the babies that I know, are completely present from the moment of birth, and they are in some sense calling out to us for a kind of relationality that confirms and affirms who they are, and that actually influences their biological development virtually hour by hour.
When mothers and babies spend long time together, which is the important thing, having had the skin to skin, mothers should carry the baby in a sling close to your body. Now, in this interaction, what then happens is that speech and language develop. Mothers and babies play peekaboo, and they read stories. And in that way, yes, school development is enhanced. But actually, the early paths, the early development that's taking place when we're in skin-to-skin contact and when we're breastfeeding is emotional intelligence and social intelligence. Now, you can get cognitive intelligence, IQ, without emotional and social intelligence. You can, certainly you can. So I don't want to say that there's a straight line effect. So the important thing to distinguish is that what you're doing at this first hours of life is ensuring your emotional and social intelligence. To get a good schooling outcome, you now have the best launch pad for a trajectory. From this best launch pad, you now want to make sure that you play lots of peekaboo with your baby when it's awake and not when it's asleep, that you read stories, that you carry, that you play with your baby. Now, you're continuing the trajectory for good development. You haven't ensured it. And so it's not a straight line. It's not do this and that will happen. You've got to do all the pieces. And at each point, if you can make this trajectory the best one, then you will get that good outcome.
Babies begin to interact reciprocally in a very playful way. So right from the beginning, play plays a crucial role in helping children understand how social relationships happen, the kind of play that we think of as typical play that really doesn't emerge with other children until usually the second year of life or maybe even a little bit beyond. Play really begins right from the very start, and we can see aspects of play prenatally, during the newborn period, all through infancy and on into the toddler stage of development. Learning to read is really a part of language development. And language development, as we've talked about, begins even in prenatal life. It begins with the recognition of speech, the special recognition of your mom's speech or your dad's speech, with the to and fro interaction verbally in the first year of life. The talking to an infant, the exchange of information between infant and parent, that then blossoms into full language development over those first few years of life, that then leads on to the ability to read and understand written language. So all of these things are like links in a chain that one leads to another, to another, to another. And it's a continuous chain of influence that begins prenatally and extends on into the primary school years.
I know there's a trite old phrase about it takes a village to raise a child, but I do firmly believe that a family and a community need to provide an envelope of services around a newborn baby so that the family can do the best job they can raising this infant and we have a functional member of our society.